Good evening and welcome everyone to our March lecture here at the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Life at Princeton University. Welcome all of you and welcome to our alumni and community friends joining us over live stream via Zoom. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Gibson. I serve as director for the Princeton Initiative in Catholic Thought at the Aquinas Institute, and I'm very delighted to see you all here, a full house for our lecture and for our lecturer, Father Andrew Dalton, who will be speaking with us this evening on the subject of the Shroud of Turin, a very fitting subject as we approach Holy Week. A few words about Father Andrew, Father Dalton. He's a Catholic priest of the Legionaries of Christ and professor of theology at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome, where he teaches courses on the Synoptic Gospels and biblical languages. And more recently, he is the author of Fulfilled Israel, Matthew's Pleurosis Paradigm. Father Dalton also obtained a postgraduate certificate in Shroud Studies, turning to the subject of tonight's lecture, in 2011, and he became a board member of Athonia, an international center of investigation on the Shroud, in 2017. And since 2018, he's been working with Shroud experts all over the world in order to deepen our knowledge about the Shroud, bringing it to university audiences. And perhaps more recently, you'll have seen him sharing about the Shroud with Matt Fradd on Pints with Aquinas, the popular Catholic podcast and YouTube channel. Tonight, then, to speak with us on the subject of the Shroud of Turin, please join me in welcoming Father Andrew Dalton.
Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you for coming tonight. I'm so excited to share with you. I am still a little out of whack with my time zones here, so I always say, if I fall down, just pick me up and we'll keep going. It'll be fine. In fact, this is the first of 4 college campuses, and I'm really curious to see what kind of interaction. I encourage questions at the end, so feel free to write them down, and at the end we'll have about a half an hour, and you're more than welcome to ask away. All right, so how to begin this fascinating subject of the Shroud of Turin is the most studied archaeological object in the history of the world. But there really are 2 different lenses with which we can see this. I think I can step away. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And the first, of course, is the lens of Christian faith. And it's no surprise why Christians are interested in this relic, because, well, it's mentioned in the scriptures, in fact, 3 times in just 3 verses, in a passage that's very familiar because it's proclaimed on Easter Sunday, John chapter 20. And so for sure, if this is that cloth, if this is the cloth that wrapped Jesus Christ, and if bloodstains, the blood that was shed for the salvation of the world, if that's on that cloth, that's going to tug on our heartstrings, I think, pretty obviously. If it's a face of the man who is God in the flesh, well, obviously, for those who have Christian faith, it's going to be of interest. And so it's dealt with as an object of Christian devotion for long centuries. Okay? That's one lens that we could look through to examine the Shroud. Of course, it's also just there for all to study. It's an archaeological object in the sense that we can look at it and discern what it tells us about what took place, if anything. And so people, even skeptics, have looked at it and it is one of the most studied objects precisely for this reason, that we don't know how to recreate it artificially. That is, the image that is there is so unique that even though it's been studied in every sector of science, we're going to talk about physics and chemistry and X-ray and infrared and pyrolysis mass spectroscopy and carbon dating and pollen samples and blood samples and sticky tape samples, its mysteries remain. We don't know how to recreate this image. And so that's what I want to propose to you tonight, is that let's look with the eyes, for a moment, the eyes of a pilgrim. That is, compare with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and try to understand how they understood the role of this cloth. What part did it play in the narrative? And then shift gears and ask, well, from the perspective of Shroud Science, what does it tell us about what this man suffered? Okay, so I want to begin with a passage this is John chapter 19. This is the burial of Jesus. Notice the specific language that the evangelists use here. So Nicodemus, who had come first by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. So this is 100 Roman pounds. That's like 75 of our pounds of these aromatics. And what does he do? They took the body of Jesus, that is Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, these men from the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, they take the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices. How many spices? 75 pounds of spices. As is the burial custom of the Jews. Okay, so this is a really important indication. He says, just like the Jews do it. Okay, well, it just so happens that in this very same gospel, we have yet another burial of another Jewish man. And that's in chapter 11. And so it's an invitation to remember Lazarus. Lazarus who was placed in the tomb. Lazarus who also had a face cloth. The Greek word is a sudarion, or sudarium is literally a sweat cloth or a head napkin. In other words, some of the similar elements that we find in Jesus' burial are also found in this according to the custom. And it says there, if you remember, Lazarus is bound with linen strips at his hands and his feet. And so when Jesus calls him out of the tomb, he says, unbind him, which makes sense if there's something to unbind. Evidently, there was ties around the hands and feet. Okay, why is that important? Well, because Jesus is buried in this way. And now watch what we read as we come to discover the empty tomb. That's the important background to read the passage of the resurrection of Jesus. So here it is in verse 1 that Mary Magdalene gets up early in the morning on Easter Sunday, but not early enough, right? Because the body of Jesus is already gone. And so she runs to go tell Simon Peter and the beloved disciple. Presumably that's John, according to tradition, right? And so she says, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. Evidently there was a we, by the way. So more than one woman. It was Mary Magdalene and perhaps other women. But Peter comes out with the other disciple, and they went to the tomb. They both ran, but the beloved disciple runs faster, reaches the tomb first. And I love verse 5. It says, stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but did not go in. Okay, this is really interesting for those. Has anybody been to Israel here, by the way? Two, three, just very few. 3 or 4 out of the whole room. Okay, so I should explain this. You can visit first century tombs from the time of Jesus that look just this way. There's a staircase down, and then there would be a curved rock in the ground on which you could roll a stone. You know, we have sliding glass doors today. They had something similar, just without glass. It would roll this way and then seal the tomb shut. Okay, the reason that's important is that when you cross that threshold, now you enter into the tomb. Against the far wall would be a sill or a bench, and then you would lay the body on that sill, wrapped in a cloth, right? So if you're not going to walk all the way in, but you want to see what's inside, what do? You're standing at the top of a staircase. You can't get an angle deep inside unless you crouch. So see how that's just a little detail, but it corresponds to what we know about first century tombs? I love that that historical detail is there. He stoops and he sees. What did he see? Watch out for the vocabulary. Every detail is important here. It's not the word we found in Matthew and Mark and in Luke. They describe, in Greek, a syndon. A syndon is a shroud, a long sheet, big enough to cover a man's body, evidently, because, do you remember in the arrest, Jesus in his agony, there's a young man, this neaniskos. It's very strange. He runs away naked when the guards grab onto his tunic, and in order to slip away, he says, well, I'll save my skin, leave my tunic behind. Well, that tunic is actually a syndon. It's, in other words, big enough to cover a man's body, okay? So the shroud is the cloth that covers Jesus in his burial in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, Luke also uses another word, but let's leave that aside. The word we find in John is othonia. Othonia is a neuter plural. It's translated not linen cloth, but linen cloths, like with an S at the end. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. Why does he zig when the others zagged? You know, why does he do something different? And we've got to pay attention to that detail. It's lying there, and he sees it. And you're like, okay, well, where does this discourse keep going? And like right now, I'm scratching my head. He saw the linen cloths lying there, did not go in. Okay, thanks. Well, then Simon Peter comes in after the beloved disciple, and he follows him. He went into the tomb. In other words, down the stairs, past the threshold of where the rock sealed shut the tomb, right? And it says he saw the linen cloths lying. It's the second time he mentioned this. He saw the othonia, and he uses that same participle, lying. I'm going to come back to that one. Like, why are we talking about this? He goes on, and the napkin. Oh, he saw also the handkerchief, that face cloth, which had been on his head. It's not lying with the linen cloths. That's the third mention in 3 verses of the othonia. And at this point, and he wants to tell you, but look, it's rolled up in a separate place by itself. And I want to stop the evangelist. This, like, shake him by the lapels and be like, why are we talking about this? There are so many details about the life of Jesus, the passion of Jesus. Look at the scourging. We were just reading it last night in a small group. It's relegated to a subordinate clause. It's not even a full sentence of its own. The scourging of Jesus. Like, do you have a little bit of curiosity about that? I know I do. Like, how many people were scourging him? What was the instrument of torture? How many lashes did he bleed? Did it scrape his skin, or did it just leave a bruise? The evangelist is painfully discreet about so many details. We would love to know, but when it comes to the dirty laundry on Easter Sunday, I'm going to go on and on about that. Okay? And you got to be like, why, John, are we talking about this? Do you see why this is of interest? Get to the climax in verse 8, the very next verse. Then the other disciple, the one who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and, remember this one? He saw and believed. He saw and believed. This is arguably the first moment recorded anywhere in the Gospels that distinctively Christian faith is mentioned. And it's mentioned in connection with the discovery of the empty tomb and these cloths lying. I'm going to come back to that verb. Do you know the participle lying has been, it's fun to look in translations because the translators, they don't know what to do with this word. And sometimes they'll add things like, it's lying on the ground, or it's lying there. And yet, in Greek, none of those descriptors are there. Instead, it's likely that this word simply means lying flat. You know, like a balloon that's lost its air, because there's no contents inside, now that the body of Jesus is absent, the cloth is able to lie flat. But you remember, what else was bound inside those cloths? 75 pounds of spices, right? What about that? This isn't mentioned, so now we're going to speculate a little bit here. Is it possible that that which was bound inside with the body is still there. Like, that would make sense to me. But now the cloth is lying flat, and he sees potentially, remember it was bound inside that cloth. And what happened with Lazarus? Well, he was bound. Remember, there were strips at the hands and at the feet. Can you imagine seeing, or just to give you a graphic example, I had pizza for lunch, so I'm going to use that as an example. Imagine you have some leftover slices, and you say, all right, I'm going to save this, so I'm going to put some plastic wrap around it, and I'll put it in the fridge, and so Father Zach doesn't eat my 2 slices later. I put a padlock on the fridge. And now I safely go away for the weekend, and I come back, and then I see, to my surprise, like the fridge door is flung open, the padlock is on the ground of the kitchen, and I open that drawer where I left my pizza, and lo and behold, there's that plastic wrap, and it's the exact same position and orientation that I left it 3 days prior, but guess what? No pizza. No pizza. And so I would likely see it lying flat, right? Because the contents that were there now aren't. And so that would probably, like, what did my pizza just dematerialize or something? Or what happened here, right? You can see that it's significant that he said he saw and believed. Notice he didn't say, despite what he saw, he believed anyway. No, it's in light of what he saw that he, in other words, there were reasons to believe. There was a condition of the empty tomb. Something about what he saw and the way that he saw it invited or prompted a response. And the proper response was that of faith, according to the evangelist. So if that's true, then our passage begins with natural sights, natural organs peering from a distance with a blurry vision that get more detailed as we get closer. Do you know that the first instance of sight is John from a distance? He saw. And then Peter goes in, right? He saw. And then in the third month, he saw and believed. Same verb, right? Not in Greek. In Greek, 3 distinct verbs because there is an intensification. There's a movement. There's an increase. There's a crescendo. And it climaxes in faith. There's sight, and then there's sight. There's supernatural vision. But the passage doesn't actually end there, thanks be to God, right? Because Mary Magdalene stays at the tomb. And in a moment, Jesus is going to, in the guise of a gardener, say good morning and say, Mary. And she turns and recognizes Rabboni, and they embrace. And so think about that. It begins with reason, or reason, which is the beginning of observation. And then it moves towards faith, this chapter. But then it climaxes in encounter. And so I think that's significant for understanding what our life is as Christians too. Now, granted, we're putting on the lens of Christianity here, aren't we? This is why Christians are interested in the shroud, because it's been called the silent witness to the resurrection. I mean, think of it. No one was there the moment the cadaver became a living body. But the shroud was in contact with the body. Could it be the one that bears witness? And when it bears that witness, that's precisely when Christian faith begins. At least the first baby steps towards faith in the living, breathing, glorified, divinized Jesus, who is present there in glory. All right, so that's the introduction to understand why Christians are interested in the shroud. Let's shift gears. Let's talk Shroud Science for a second. So I'm going to put down the lens of the Bible, and I just want to pick up the instrumentation is pretty Spartan, or it's not so sophisticated. This is 1898. The first dactylographs or cameras are invented in like 1840. So this is the new technology of the day. And Secondo Pia, an amateur photographer, is invited to snap a photo of the Shroud of Turin, which is in the possession of the Savoy family, the royal family in Italy. And so what happens when he goes to develop the photograph? Do you remember this? Before the age of digital photography, you had to carry into a dark room and then put into a solution so that the photo negative would come to light, and from there you could make your prints, right? And so this is the face of the man of the shroud as it's seen, what's called the positive image, okay? So if you kind of squint, and maybe those who are in the back can do it more easily, you can see kind of 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, a beard. But let's be honest, it's something of a ghostly image, right? It's hard to discern the details. Can you imagine the surprise of Secondo Pia, the first human to lay eyes on not the positive image, but the photo negative, which looks like this? He records how he almost dropped the plate when he laid eyes on this, because this is the first thing that he noticed about it is it's just anatomically perfect. The details here. So I always like to point out the eyes. Do you know, if you look at icons throughout the centuries, Jesus is often portrayed, it's almost cartoonish, isn't it? You know, it reminds me a little bit, sorry Jesus, of Bart Simpson and Homer Simpson, you know, those big bug eyes. Because it makes sense, right? Like if you're thinking that those are the outlines around the eyeballs, you could understand why you would paint it in that way. But what if it's the subtle contours in the sockets around the eyes, the depressions around the eyes? I mean, we can see inflammation in the beard, the separation of the lips, the plucked beard. There are many forensic details that I want to come back to. But again, what's noticed, even by secular scientists, is that this image is anatomically perfect with regard to the proportions of the body, so morphology, but then also pathologies, like the sufferings that this man has, are recorded with such anatomical precision that it's hard to doubt that it proceeds from a body that suffered, okay? And this isn't Christian believers writing about this. In Paris, at the turn of the century, around the year 1900, a certain Yves Delage will write a paper for the Académie des Sciences, and the conclusion of that paper is that the man of the shroud is Jesus of Nazareth. This is not a believer. He's not making faith claims when he says so. He's just saying, look, Jesus is a historical person. We know about him from history. And the sufferings that this man has, the combination of sufferings, which is so unique, because remember, Jesus was crowned with thorns. He was scourged. He was crucified with nails in the hands and in the feet, blows to the face. All of these details align, correspond, are compatible with what we see on the shroud. Okay? So they probably erected a statue to Secondo Pia for his great findings, right? They gave applause, they gave prizes to Yves Delage, who wrote this paper. The man of the shroud is Jesus of Nazareth, right? Wrong. No. They laughed him out of the scientific community. That's what they did. They ostracized him. This poor Yves Delage. Yves Delage would write his colleagues and say, if I were writing about Xerxes or some pharaoh, no one would have anything to say, but Jesus is a sign of contradiction. I thought that's remarkable to think about. That was over a century ago. Like, where are we now with that question? But Jesus continues to catch eyes, for sure. And especially when you try to speak of him in a way that is not mythical, right? But as a historical figure, an event that actually took place, right? This is very much against our common culture today. What we're going to find out is that Giuseppe Enrie, now a professional photographer who works with orthochromatic film, creates some of the most beautiful photographs. This is 33 years after Secondo Pia, and he discerns that, yes, the whole shroud acts as a photo document. That is, when we invert the grayscale, when we turn the lighter shades to the darkest shades, we get not a negative at all. The negative is the positive image. In other words, the shroud itself is like a negative. How does that work? 18 centuries before the invention of photography, we have a photographic effect in this ancient linen. How do we explain that? This discovery is what is the watershed. This is the dawn of Shroud Science. the fact that it encodes information in this way. All right, so it encodes this information, but not just that, it encodes three-dimensional information. And that's not visualized until 1976, when two American scientists of the United States Air Force Academy, Eric Jumper and John Jackson, they take the instrumentation that NASA scientists use to map the topography of distant planets, like without actually traveling there, trying to understand the contours, the hills and the valleys of the surface there. They would say, I wonder what happens if you slip a photo of the shroud under the VP8 image analyzer. Well, what they've discovered is that it actually renders three-dimensional information that corresponds to a human body, unlike any other burial cloth known to man. Okay, so what I'm telling you is that even the cloth is flat, it encodes 3D information that no one saw until we had the instrumentation to do it in 1976. This will mobilize the highest powered laboratories across America to get together and petition the royal family in Italy to say, let us study that shroud. Okay? And they only have one question, this crew. They want to say, by what means, by what mechanism is the image impressed upon the cloth? That's it. It's not a faith-based question, right? They just want to understand, is this a painting? Is it a rubbing? Is it a scorch? Is it a camera oscura? Maybe some sort of medieval photography of, maybe it's Leonardo da Vinci that was doing something clever, and we're going to figure it out, by golly. So they go overseas with 80 crates of the most state-of-the-art material, and they've prepped for over a year so that all their tests will be non-invasive, non-destructive. But they come home, spoiler alert, with more questions than they have answers, because they discard every viable theory that was on the table. So they will write papers. In fact, this is 1978 that it takes place. By 1981, there's several peer-reviewed scientific journal articles that come out, all of them pointing in the direction of authenticity, by the way. But the main conclusion is this. The shroud image, the image that's impressed on this cloth, is not human artwork. Isn't that a strange way of formulating it, right? They don't tell you what it is. They tell you what it's not. And so it's an open question, even today, what forged the image? We know it's not a painting because guess what? There's no paints. There's no pigment, organic or inorganic. There's no dye. There's no varnish. There's no brush strokes. There's no directionality with which color is applied to a cloth. There's nothing that soaks into the medulla of the fibers. It's just a surface phenomena that if you had a razor blade and just gently grazed over the surface, it would disappear, this image of the man's body, forever. In fact, it penetrates so superficially, I could tell you the dimensions, but I'm not sure it would mean much to you. I can't fathom what 200 to 500 nanometers is. That's 1/5 of 1,000th of a millimeter. We don't have a micro laser in 2024 that is capable of delivering a micro burn this precise. And yet there it is. The phenomena is there. We just don't know how it got there. Okay, so one physicist, his name is Paolo Di Lazzaro, who works with Enea Laboratory in Rome. He spent 5 years studying this, trying to reproduce it with radiant energy, cold radiant energy, ultraviolet excimer lasers. After 5 years, he measures the amount of radiant energy that would be required to colorize a linen cloth of this size. And his conclusion is 34,000 billion watts. Okay, so just to give a sense now, we don't have a socket somewhere with that kind of wattage available. And even if we did, we would now need to apply it to a micro laser we've not yet invented. And then we would need to apply the exposure of that light in 40 billionths of a second. This is what the physicists are telling us. Again, not a faith-based question. Just observing the data that's there and trying to explain it, trying to accommodate it with some theory, some viable theory. And the answer is, the more we study it, the further we get from actually understanding how it got there. So the shroud acts as a photo document. It encodes three-dimensional information. It's anatomically perfect, both with regard to morphology and pathology. We don't know how to reproduce it in the laboratory, despite the fact that it's the most studied archaeological object in the history of the world? How did it get there? This is where Christians say, can I have a voice in this conversation? Say, might it be that it's not a painting, not a scorch, not a camaroscura, not a rubbing? In other words, might it be that no merely naturalistic explanation stands behind the creation of this image? What if it's the natural effect of a supernatural event? What if the resurrected body itself is the cause of the image that we see? That's a different kind of proposal, isn't it? Right? And it's one that empirical science can't really measure or begin to discern. All right, so let me go into some basics here about the cloth. This is important to understand what we're looking at. You have to understand that we see the frontal and dorsal image. Okay, I've turned up the intensity on this cloth, but on this particular slide. But look, see how the shroud is so long, it's underneath his body and then over his face and over his chest and the top of his knees, right? So now when you unfold the cloth like these angels are doing for us over here, you get the frontal image. That's the portion that corresponds here, right? And then the dorsal image, of course, that's underneath. So it's only one side of the cloth that is colorized. If you could be looking from the side of the angel on the opposite side of the cloth, guess what? No image. No image whatsoever. So on one side and very superficially. Okay, so it's a mirror image. If you could see here, look, see how his right hand is over his left? But they've reversed it. Look at the right side of the torso is pierced. And then it corresponds to the left side. See the blood stain at the left side of the torso? Remember, it's lying on top of the body, this cloth. And so it's a mirror of, like when I'm in front of the mirror and I raise my right hand, the guy in the mirror raises his left, right? So they flip it when we look at when you look at the photo negative, they flip it back so you can see the man as he looked in the tomb, okay? I can't help but insert, there's a really cool line in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It said, Paul would say this, now we see dimly as in a mirror, but then face to face. Yet Paul is talking about our Christian journey. He's saying, in our life here on earth, we see through faith. We see through a veil. We don't see the living, breathing Jesus like Matthew, Mark, John. Well, Mark wasn't a good example, but one of the 12, right? They get to walk with him, talk with him. The shroud is an image, and I wonder what purpose it has in our own lives. I wonder if it's supposed to be a little invitation to see past the veil, to remember we're going somewhere. And at the end of that somewhere is a face-to-face encounter with the living, glorified Jesus. I just put that out there tentatively for now, but look at the dimensions of this cloth. This thing is gigantic. I can't begin to convey how much this would have cost. A fine linen cloth. It's comparable to like the chasuble, like a vestment of a priest. The weave is very fine. It's called a 3-to-1 herringbone weave. You go over 3 and then under 1, waft and weave. Instead, the measurements are in meters, 1.1 by 4.4. Do you know, I don't go to Home Depot and ask for, typically when I'm buying wood, the typical 1.1 by 4.4. Do you know in Syrian cubits, the international standard at the time of Jesus, Assyrian cubits, it measures 2 by 8. Perfect whole numbers. Also attesting to its ancient provenance, perhaps. Who buys such a thing? And why? Do you remember what we read in John 19? It was Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. This is the upper crust. These are the men with means that are providing for Jesus' burial. Do they have what it takes to buy something like this? Absolutely. But if you didn't have the Bible, this would actually be really tough to figure out. Like, why is there a man who's crucified? In other words, a pariah, the one who's at the bottom of the food chain here, socially speaking. He's put to a cross. Oh, yeah, he's a criminal that we're going to put on a stick to be humiliated publicly. But then we're going to bury him like a king? How do we explain that? Well, we very easily, just reading the Gospels, right? Jesus has friends in high places. He's got enemies in high places too, right? Amongst them, it's the rest of the Sanhedrin that carts him off to Pontius Pilate to get him a death sentence from the procurator by way of crucifixion. Okay? So there's the herringbone weave. I'm going to blitz through that. I'm going to blitz through this too. I want to talk to you about the scourging at the pillar. We read this, that Jesus was scourged. Do you know? We know something about Roman scourging vis-a-vis Jewish flogging. The Jewish flogging took place in a synagogue. It was with one of your brothers. You were never to exceed more than 40 lashes, right? Because you're not to treat your brother like a beast, it says in Deuteronomy, right? But then Jesus isn't being scourged by the Sanhedrin. He's not in the synagogue. It's the Roman procurator who is trying to save Jesus' skin at this moment. Do you remember the scenario? The mob outside is saying, crucify him, crucify him. And he doesn't want to. He's like, what cause of death is there in it? He finds none. 3 times he pronounces Jesus innocent and then adds, therefore I shall have him scourged and then release him to you. Like, where's the logic in that? He's innocent, but he knows that this crowd outside is not going to be easily satisfied. And so he's got to turn up the volume on this scourging. It has to be so convincing that those who are lusting for the blood of Jesus will be satisfied enough to say, oh, okay, let that guy go home. But this plan flops when he presents Jesus in the bloody mess that he is, and they just cry out all the louder, crucify him, right? But this has to be brutal if Jesus has any chance at spared his life. And so what we find here is not 40 lashes, but 120 lashes. At least if we posit that there are 3 strips, because we have 360 or more marks. That means, and by the way, we don't have the information on the sides, because we have just the front and the back. But it's likely, remember those packs of aromatics? Perhaps they're lining the sides of the bodies. We don't have the cloth curving around the stomach and to the sides here. So we don't know how many more scourge marks we might have seen. But can you imagine what 374 scourge marks means? Each one of those is comparable to a 3rd-degree burn as far as the damage that it does to the body, even if it doesn't perforate the skin. Okay? Do you know there's a line from Isaiah? If I can shift gears just for a moment to put on the lenses of a pilgrim. It says this, by his stripes we were healed. Upon him the chastisement that makes us whole, that brings us shalom, that brings us peace. In other words, according to the writers of Scripture, Jesus is paying a debt that he doesn't owe because we owe a debt that we can't pay. And that's a debt of love. And Jesus is showing that love by laying down his life as a saving sacrifice for those of us who are in the bondage of sin. And he's going to be a ransom for many in this way. That's what Isaiah, the suffering servant, is all about. Read chapter 53, 1 through 11. That's the passage we read on Good Friday, and we apply it to Jesus. All right. There's rhyme and reason to this scourging that nobody saw until the modern era. Monsignor Ritchie is going to draw a circle around every single scourge mark and find out that there's actually a pattern here. All of the scourge marks that land towards the feet and head do so at an oblique angle, whereas those that land towards the middle of the body are at a more perpendicular axis to the main body. In other words, there are 2 lictores, 2 scourgers, one on either side of the body, and they're pivoting from a single point, and they have an angle towards the feet and head, but there's an arc, there's a radius that tells us that one man is taller than the other. One man his radius is longer than the other. Nobody saw this until the modern era. And so can you imagine, on the theory that this is the work of a con artist, you have to understand that he painted this in such a way that said, if in 700 years from now somebody studies this thing, let's make sure there's some method to the madness, right? It's to be a little more convincing. It's a theory that strains credulity in my own mind. All right, I want to get to this, and with this I'll probably have to finish for the sake of time. The crown of thorns is remarkable. It's surprising. It's not what you would expect. At least if you're familiar with our churches or museums, where Jesus doesn't have a ring around, like one of these crowns that leaves the top of the head exposed. It's not that way on the shroud. Instead, every area of the head is covered. So it's not a wreath, but instead like a cap or a helmet of thorns. We have some 50 or so puncture wounds, these little flows of blood that now, especially a high accumulation of blood at the nape of the neck, and I'll show that all now. But here's a reconstruction of what the crown likely looked like. It's possible that the species of plant is the Ziziphus spina Christi. The thorns are about 3/4 of an inch long, and they might be supple and when the plant is still green, but those thorns oxidize and dry out, and now they become hard as nails, and they penetrate through the skin to the bony plate below, say the forensic doctors on this particular point. But look at this. It's likely that a pliant branch or like a wicker was used to bind together like a mess of thorn and then just pressed upon the head with a lance or a sword or a spear or something, right? And so there it is at the nape of the neck that we have this evidence of these flows of blood that are, according to gravity, trickling down and towards the center, just as you'd expect, right? We can differentiate arterial blood here at the temple from the blood that flows from the frontal vein. Do we know about the subtle differences in the 1200s about the musculature around an artery vis-a-vis a vein? I don't think so, but this is what's there. By the way, this particular blood stain, look how amorphous some of these shapes are. Compared to the sudarium, do you remember that other piece, the face cloth that we read about in John 20? We have that. It's in Spain. We've done comparative studies. And these amorphous bloodstains align such that scientists are saying it covered one and the same body. In other words, this blood, I don't know if you can see this blood stain here, but see how there's like the outline and then the center is empty? On the sudarium, they align and what's empty here is full on the other cloth. It's really convincing just visually when you see this juxtaposition. But I want to pause here because if I look just with the eyes of a scientist, I can tell you perhaps the shape of the crown, the surprise that it doesn't look like a ring but a helmet instead. I can tell you perhaps the likely length of the thorns. And all of that's interesting to some extent, but it lands me with a conclusion that goes something like this. Ouch, right? It's like, is that all I'm supposed to get out of this? Like, that really hurt. That's really painful. That's my devotion. I say this because if you look with now the eyes of a pilgrim, if you look back to the scriptures, there's much to be surprised about here. The first thing to note is that why they put this crown on him. Do you remember that Jesus is said to be, in front of Caiaphas, in front of the Sanhedrin, this trial in the middle of the night? The killer question is this: are you the Mashiach, right? Are you the Messiah, the Christos? Are you the Davidic king? And are you the Son of God? And Jesus, who had been so disciplined and answers not any of their questions, but when put under solemn oath by the high priest, whose authority he recognizes, he answers the question. But not with a word, which he could have just said yes or no, but with a whole speech. And he quotes these two messianic passages of the Old Testament when he says, ego eimi, right? I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Quoting Daniel chapter 7 and Psalm 110. And you're like, Jesus, is this really good timing for such a thing? They're itching to put you to death, and you're serving up on a silver platter everything they're looking for. And so, sure enough, the high priest rends his garments and says, blasphemy. And they all agree he's worthy of death. And so they give him to those who can administer capital punishment, Pontius Pilate. And sure enough, Jesus gets all the way to the cross. But when he does, he's wearing this crown. It's a symbol of the mockery of his own confession. Oh, you're a king? Kings need a crown. Here you go. It's so ironic, isn't it? Because, of course, they're mocking that confession. Little do they know that they're actually fulfilling the very prophecy that Jesus is. He said that he would be put to death. He said that he'd be mocked. He said that he'd be spat upon. And they're mocking his own prophetic powers as they're bringing to completion that which he prophesied. Jesus is king, but he's not the king that wears a gold crown. He's not like Gentile kings at all. He's the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. And so that crown becomes a symbol of the paradoxical lordship of Jesus. That's how it functions in the narrative of the gospel. It's a picture of Jesus, the King of Kings, who subverts our very vision of kingship. There he is, the King of Kings, not a golden crown, but a crown of thorns. What was thorns representative of Genesis? In the original paradise in Eden, there's every type of tree that's good for fruit. There are no thorns in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. They are ushered in with the fall. They're the consequence of the original sin. Remember, the Lord God says to Adam, because you have eaten of the forbidden fruit of which I said, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed be the ground because of you. This curse that is upon the cosmos takes a particular shape. Thorns and thistles shall come forth from the earth. Thorns are the symbol of chaos, disorder, and sin. Jesus is crowned with thorns. In other words, without even opening his mouth, but just by having thorns upon his head, he's saying, for those who have eyes to see or ears to hear, I'm the sin bearer. I bear the sins of the world. That's something that the microscope can't pick up. That Jesus is claiming to be not only the Messiah, crowned in glory, but the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, that he's saying, I'm the sin bearer. That you can only pick up if you know the context in which this story is told. All right, so I tell you what, I could always go on. We have a year-long postgraduate certificate on Shroud study, where we explore the science of the scripture from history, from forensic medicine to physics and chemistry. If you want more, sign up for that. But I'm going to hit pause on my presentation so that I can field your questions, which I think would be much more exciting. Can we do that? Does anybody have something that they want to ask? Please. And I think we've got a microphone.
To go around, so just raise your hand.
Thank you for the marvelous presentation. I have also kind of heard externally that the bloodstains themselves are beneath the image. That also adds to the impossibility of this being a painting of sorts, because the bloodstains would have to be perfectly placed before you actually put the image of the person there. I just had a quick question, though, about the provenance of the artifact. If it were contemporary with Passion, where was it for almost 1,300 years before it enters written record?
Great questions. Okay, so let me go in order. The first question is, which is there first, the bloodstains or the body image? Which is underneath which? Great question. Do you know, because if you're a painter, isn't it true that you're more likely to paint the outline of the body? And then, depending on where the wrist is, well, then you'll add the bloodstain on top of where you think the nail wound went in. That's perfectly logical. But it's just the other way around. We know that the bloodstain was there before the body image was there. Because if you look under the bloodstain, there is no body image. This is easier to explain if I can use an analogy for a second. So, you know when you have to put on sunscreen and you want to make sure you don't miss a spot, because otherwise you'll be like mozzarella all over, but a little tomato right in the middle of your back. Like, this is what happens to me when I'm embarrassed to ask my brother seminarians to, like, hey, can you get that spot? No, I'll do it myself. Thank you. I'll do it myself. But you don't, and then you're trying to go to sleep at night, and you're like, oh, that really hurts, because you got scorched right where you failed to put sunscreen, right? Okay, so use that image to think about the blood. The blood is like the sunscreen. In other words, where there's blood, there is no micro burn of the linen afterwards. That is to say, it seems that the blood stain, it makes sense that it's there first, because look, the body of Jesus is put into contact with the cloth on Friday night as he's laid to rest, right? But the image is not yet there. There's no body image until 3 days later. Okay, so how do we know that? Again, underneath the blood stain, there is no body image that shows that the blood stain is added after. And so it just comports with the gospel story that first comes burial and then comes resurrection. And it comports with this theory that the resurrection is the cause of that image. Remember, a supernatural effect a supernatural event that gives way to a natural effect. That's the theory that I think holds water best, right, of all those that are on the table today. Then, you asked about historical provenance. I probably have a slide here that goes into this to some extent. I'm not sure if I have that. Really? Yeah. I have this just for questions. Sometimes I have, and I'm not sure which slide this is. So I'm just gonna talk about it. How about that? So here's the story. The earliest legend goes back to Abgar. Okay, so Abgar the Fifth is king in Edessa, and according to this legend, it's one of the 12. So Thaddeus Jude, not Judas Iscariot, but the other Judas, is the one who brings the image of the Savior to him, and this leprous king venerates this cloth that bears the image of Jesus. And when he does so, he's cured of his leprosy. That's the legend, right? And we have pictures. We have illuminated manuscripts that tell this story. It's really interesting. So according to this legend, the tradition is that right after, within one generation of Jesus, the shroud goes north to modern-day Turkey, right? And then it's there until 544, because they're reconstructing the city walls of Edessa after the flood of 525, and they find in the niche of the city wall this cloth, which goes by different names. Sometimes it's the image of Edessa, or the mandilion, right? Or sometimes the tetradiplon, the four-folded cloth. Do you know, if you looked at the lines of symmetry on the shroud, you would find exactly 4 folds. I should point that out just to see that I'm not making this stuff up. The tetradiplon, look at this. Can you see here that there are fire marks, these here and here? You see the water stains that are here? See these, what is that, like a diamond shape? Those are water stains. The symmetry on the water stains and on the fire marks are the same. That is to say, we know that it was folded in half, and in half again, and half again, and half again, now horizontally. They wanted the face to be present, evidently. So it's interesting that history tells us that there is this cloth called the four-folded cloth. Could it be what is today called the Shroud of Turin? Some historians think so. Anyway, so according to this itinerary, it's in Jerusalem, 33 AD. It's in Edessa soon after. It goes 544 in the building. It's there in Edessa until 944. So this is when Romanus I, who is emperor in modern-day Istanbul, in Constantinople at the time, and he wants to gather together all the relics of Christ's Passion under his roof. And so off it goes to Istanbul. But it's there until the Fourth Crusade. This is when European crusaders sack and pillage, basically. They steal these prized relics and bring it into Europe. And so it's not likely that they would have raised their hands and said, oh, look what I got, a little souvenir from sacking. No, instead it appears 150 years later in the hands of a French nobleman by the name of Geoffroy de Charny. So this Geoffroy has ties to the Knights Templar, and so some think that it passed through the hands of European crusaders until it felt safe enough to now put it on public display. So as of 1354 onwards, we know every baby step that this linen has moved, right? So it goes in 1453 to Chambéry in France. Oh, excuse me. So it's in Lirey in the hands of Geoffroy in northern France, and then 1453 in Chambéry, and then in the 1570s goes to Torino, north of Rome, like 4.5 hours. Remember, the northern portion of Italy is the hub was Turin, of an area that goes into modern-day France. The southern France is the Haute-Savoie, the Savoy family reigning even there. Okay, so that's the itinerary, but there's question marks about it. Remember, we know the provenance with exact precision after 1354. But what about these missing years, as they're called, between 1204, the Fourth Crusade, and 1354? Where was it? In whose hands? We don't have an unbroken chain. But we do have these signal points, right? We have, really important, is the Hungarian Praecodex of, what's the year? 1192 or 1195. Let me pull up this slide. This is fascinating. Because we know with great precision its date. Look at this. This is remarkable. This is a comic strip from the 12th century, right? And we have in scene 1, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, anointing a body. Look, he's got this special cross on his halo. That's surely Jesus, right? See how he's in the tomb over a cloth, a linen here? Look at his hands. They're folded about the waist, just like on the shroud. How many fingers do you count? Look, there's no thumbs. On the shroud, you can't see the thumbs. They're tucked under the index finger. Some think that's the result of the pierced nerve that's here in the hands. Be that as it may, you can't see the thumbs on the shroud or on this man. There's no doubt to my mind that he's talking about the image of the shroud, especially as you see scene 2 of the comic strip, right? So scene 2 is now the women with their flasks of oil ready to anoint a body that isn't there because the angel is saying, why do you look for the living amongst the dead? He's not here. He's been raised. And so now we see the cloth again in scene 2, but with much greater detail. Look how it's just flat here. But now we see the weave. Can you even see the diagonal lines? It's the herringbone weave that you can see on the Shroud of Turin. We can even see the so-called poker holes. Look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4 little circles in the exact same position of like a 7 or an L, the exact same position and orientation as on the shroud. Nobody doubts that this is the Shroud of Turin, and he's not even explaining, he's not defending it, he's just enunciating it like this doesn't need defending. This is from 1192. So certainly the shroud is at least as old as that, right? And so remember I told you about earlier the comparative studies of the Sudarium. The Sudarium has a provenance of at least as old as 610. So remember, if it covers the same body, the shroud is at least as old as 610. We have coins, we have icons. One is from the 6th century. We have an icon at the Pantocrator in Mount Sinai, which is one of the most striking resemblances. Do you know in court what you need is 50 points of coincidence or correspondence. If you're going to draw a picture of a criminal and then hold up a photograph, it had better match with at least 50 points of coincidence or correspondence. We have some 250 points of correspondence with the shroud image and these icons that date back to the 6th century. And so it's likely that the prototype that they're copying is the shroud itself. And so see how it's not just one argument, but it's the cumulative force of so many correspondences that makes a strong case for authenticity here. Some other questions? Yeah, John. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Father. I'm wondering, has anyone done any studies generally on the weaves of ancient Judean burial cloths, or do we even have any? And if so, do we find resemblance to the herringbone weave? And then, I guess relatedly, is there any sense that this changes at various period? Does this, for example, change in the Middle Ages? I mean, I know there's the the so-called French weave of like is it the top left corner?
Right.
But is that just a different type of weave? Is that a different type of weave for
Yes.
burial cloths, or?
Right. Yeah, so I should explain some details here. What you're referring to is the theory of a certain Sue Benford, who has since passed away, but she proposed that at this top left corner, we have what's called French invisible weaving. She brought the textile to a number of experts who didn't even know what they were looking at. They were just supposed to describe it. And they said, oh, this is strange. It looks like there's misalignment in the weave. Because a weave is very regular. You go over 3 and under 1 and over 3 every single time. You don't interrupt the pattern. But here, the experts were saying, it seems that we have a splice of one fabric together with another fabric. And so this was just proposed as a theory before she actually had contact with the cloth. She writes a paper, it gets on shroud.com, the most scientific website on the internet. And so it gets, and so really, like, top tier chemists were saying, why are you publishing this paper from the lunatic fringe on our scientific website? And so the webmaster, Barry Schwartz, who's Jewish, he was my teacher, by the way, in my Roman Pontifical University, but he said, look, Barry, or Ray Rogers, this chemist, she follows the scientific method. I think it's an interesting theory. I want to put it out there for scrutiny. And so sure enough, it's taken up by this chemist. He says, I'm going to prove her wrong in 5 minutes. He says, well, Ray, go ahead. They hang up the phone. Ray Rogers goes to his manila folder. He went home with a sample of the shroud in 1978. And he examines it for 90 minutes, calls back Barry and says, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think she's right. He finds evidence of cotton on this sample. And the shroud is universally linen. And so it's like, why is there cotton here? Certainly Jewish cloths didn't mix animal and plant. Like, that would be ritually impure. Anyway, so it's taken as a theory for a time. After her death, the very corner of that shroud gets given to the Los Alamos Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And now, post-mortem, Ray Rogers, he publishes his paper in a peer-reviewed scientific journal article called Thermochemica Acta in 2005, and 6 weeks later, he dies. But the sample gets passed on to this Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Los Alamos, and they confirm his theory when they discover the splice that we have. In other words, when the weave of something, imagine instead of a patch, which is so obvious, right? Imagine you have cloth A and cloth B, and then I stitch them together with a weave. It's so obvious, right? Instead, what if we unravel the threads on this side, unravel the threads on the other, and we put them together in a technique called French invisible weave. And now our new cloth, which is white vis-a-vis the yellowed linen, how do we make it look uniform? We add a plant gum that absorbs into the new cotton, but not into the oxidized linen, and so it looks uniform. But now you've added new organic material that skews dating now if you're going to char a sample, right? So she proposes that, and it gets taken up by many. It's not taken up by all, I should say. And I'm all for science and let the best man win kind of thing. There is if you're interested in the linens, what is her name? Fleury Limburg, Mathilde Fleury Limburg, I think is the name. She looked at this, and she is not convinced. She said, I studied that thing firsthand. I did not find any misalignment. So she doesn't think there is any French invisible weave. What we do need to know is this, that whether we go with Benford's theory, that there's 16th century material that's added on to that corner or not, what everybody knows and was a matter of consensus view from the scholarship today is that corner is not representative of the rest of the cloth. Okay, and a good indication of that is just looking at the fluorescence. When you shine UV and you capture what fluoresces back, it's predicated upon the chemical composition of the cloth, which is uniform throughout. You're going to get warm hues, yellow, orange, red, throughout the 14-foot long cloth. But when you get to that top left corner, look, it's forest green. Like, anyone could look at that, like a kindergartner, and say, look, Mom, that part is different. That is exactly the corner that is used to carbon date it in 1988. And so that was a botched job. Thanks be to God, it's a matter of mainstream science today that was poorly conducted, and that it was on a sample that is simply anomalous. Even the different portions of the sample, which is only 8 centimeters long, they cut that in half. So a 4-centimeter strip was given to Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich. The raw data is now out from the laboratory, something they did not publish in the 1980s. But because of a Freedom of Information Act, the laboratories were compelled by law to release the raw data. And now we know that they're not homogeneous. They're heterogeneous amongst themselves, and they're anomalous with regard to the rest of the shroud. And so it's simply not indicative of, they're not representative of the shroud, and they don't tell us a date. And so we need to, and this is, again, it's not somebody's personal opinion. At the very Oxford publication, so Nature magazine in 1988, or 80, what year is it that they publish? 89 they publish. And then now in 2015, their conclusions are reversed. They said they had definitive proof that it's medieval. Now they renege on that conclusion. And so it's fair game, once again, to say, could it be from the 1st century? So maybe some bright scientists here can carry that conversation forward. To answer your question about other cloths, yes. And by the way, right there in Jerusalem, you might know that south of Jerusalem, you have the Valley of Gehenna, right? So there is a cave there called, oh my gosh, the Tomb of the Shroud. So look up the Tomb of the Shroud, that they actually have a shroud from the time of Jesus, very close. We have other cloths, by the way, that are much older, like Egyptian cloths that are thousands of years old. So some have said, is it a miracle that we still have the cloth? It's not in the naturalist, there's no need to posit a miracle just for the existence of the cloth. Keep in mind, we don't have a lot, though, because a burial cloth is usually around a cadaver, which decomposes and putrefies. And so along with it, the organic material that's in contact with it. But in this case, that didn't occur, and so it is quite unique. In fact, it's in a class all its own. We have a few more minutes, guys. If there's any more, it looks like there's plenty. Could you say that again?
That they were able to get 3D data from the cloth.
Yeah.
I was wondering if they could use that to kind of create a 3D model of Jesus, or if they ever found dimensions of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Shed light on any other Jesus' ministry or activity based on his dimensions.
Interesting. Yeah, so he's asking about Jesus' dimensions. So keep in mind that this is a linen cloth. There is some flexibility, and we measured it, we ironed it in, what was that, 2020 or thereabouts, and it grew by quite a few centimeters. All right, so these are questions that you have to keep in mind. Like, sometimes when people say, okay, it's 5'11", right? It's not that the man is significantly taller than anyone. It's just that the cloth is flexible, right? And also keep in mind that the chin is very close to the sternum, right? So remember, he's hanging on the cross. Then he's in rigor mortis after death. That is the cadaveric rigidity that sets in a few hours after death and then leaves you hard as a rock. This is very clear in the buttocks, which are curved. It's not like, soft tissue that you press against a window pane will be forced flat. That's not the case here because he's rock solid. And so if his knees are bent, it's not because there's a triangular support under his legs. It's that he was pinned on the cross, and now he's kept in that position because of this rigor mortis. Okay, so he's not standing tall, in other words, to get a good measurement. So we have to do some calculating. Plus, remember that bit about the strips around the hands and feet? Well, there's actually evidence of that. On the shroud, we have an interrupted image on the front that is higher than the heels, or the ankles, but lower than the knees. There's evidence of a strip that creates a crease. And so it's likely that that's the reason that he's taller on the frontal image than he is on the dorsal image, right? Because we've stretched out the legs and the level of the shins. Okay, so it's a hard thing to answer, in other words, but they often put it at around 5'11", 175 pounds, give or take. I think that the interest, you said, did it correspond to something else about Jesus' life or ministry? I can't think anything of his ministry so much, but absolutely as far as his death, right, and the position that he held. So for example, the position on the cross is remarkable. Look, when you're on the ground, you'd be stretched out at 90 degrees, right? You would drive in the nail in such a way that there's a pre-established hole in the patibulum. That is the crossbeam that would be used again and again for multiple crucifixions. Then you would stretch out the arm to the other and make it reach the hole on the other side. If it didn't reach, you would make it reach by dislocating the shoulder and then driving in the nail. So we find that nail wound, it's with such precision, so that you would take a 9-inch nail with a square cross-section and you would drive it in with a hammer on the other side, drive it in through the wrist, right at Desstot's space or Z space. To find that spot, just put your pinky and your thumb together and bend down 90 degrees. And now under your thumb, many of us have anyway, this is called the thenar furrow. Right here, that's where the nail enters in. It exits out 1.5 centimeters higher on the opposite side. That's what's sustaining the weight of the body. 2 nails in that spot. And so if he's at 90 degrees on the ground when the nails are driven in, now when he's hoisted up and made to, he's fixed to the stipes, the vertical piece, he sags some 25 degrees. And all the weight of his body is hanging on those nails. Do you know there's 2 nerves that pass through that area? The ulnar nerve and the thenar nerve, or the ulnar and median nerve. And they're not just sense nerves. That is to say, they're not just motor nerves, but they're also sense nerves. It's sending like waves of pain through the central nervous system to the brain for 3 to 6 hours as he's hanging on the cross. And we know he's pivoting around a nail. We know that because there's 2 flows of blood emanating from a single point. And the reason for that is that he has to breathe. And the only way to breathe is to rise up. That is, your intercostal muscles that regulate your breathing. When you breathe in, watch, I'll exaggerate for a second. I breathe in, I breathe out. Easy to do when my hands are low, but what if they're stretched high? All you can do is press down on the nail in your hand, pull and twist in such a way that you allow these muscles to relax, and now you can exhale. Draw breath. But you can't hold that position for any time. Your muscles are on fire, you collapse again. And back and forth because it's instinctual. You have to breathe. And so we have this very sophisticated, very complex pattern, but it corresponds to 2 points that he's going back to. This is very sophisticated, and yet the Shroud records it with great precision. So I think that's the kind of insight that we get. What does it tell us about his life? And to me, it tells me this. Look, if that were me, I would not budge an inch if I could help it. If that were me, I would not say a word. And yet Jesus, if that's what he's doing to breathe, what is the love behind every sentence that he utters? And what he's uttering is this: Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Do you know in the Greek that's introduced with a verb in the imperfect? Not he said, but he was saying. Likely a refrain that was repeated throughout the Passion. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. We have soldiers in World War II that had an exposed median nerve and did not have morphine. Some preferred to commit suicide than to endure the pain. In fact, this is pain that's so unique, it gets its own word. Do you ever pause to think about excruciating pain? Do you know that comes from the root ex crux, crucis? That's the word for the cross. So this was engineered by the Romans to be the summum supplicium, right? The highest of all punishments. And this is what Jesus endures. And as he endures it, he's praying for us, offering an excuse for us. My guess is that was a ringtone to remind me that we're about out of time. I think we're going to have to close there. All I can invite you to do is check out online. I did some longer interviews if you want more. And please, if you're interested to go deeper, we always need more students, more experts. Bring your expertise to the conversation, which is ongoing. So thank you for your time and your attention. That's been very wonderful.